I'm just going to start really with a brief summary about what we're going to be talking about in the podcast series, which I guess the aim is to briefly this morning frame up how did we get going? You know, what brought us together, what initiated our interest to develop ROG, what inspired us.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking quite a lot of that is probably coming from the dynamics of our relationship and what we've been doing.
Yeah.
And the aim also to come out of this being something very practical, you know, about so if we take ROG chunk by chunk, what do you actually do with it at work?
Yes.
But also, is there any wisdom in there for your life?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I think there's another context, and I don't know if it's too quick to move to that, but this context of what a relational meant. You know, there was some sort of relational turn context that was happening in certainly in Gestalt, but maybe even you know the early days in the wider psychotherapeutic world before it even reached organizations. I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Well, I guess when I started in Gestalt, you know, which would have been mid-80s, Gestalt was very much about individual need, meeting individual need in a field full of resources, where once you had identified your need, the aim was to aggress on the field to meet that. And the relational turn in Gestalt, and I guess coming through psychotherapy, was what's the impact, you know, outside of the individual self of people always meeting their needs? And, you know, our intention might be to find something satisfying and wholesome and nourishing for ourselves. But if that causes harm to the people we love around us or the organizations we view as competitors, the planet, the country next door, you know, what's the implication of that as an overarching individualistic frame? So the relational, you know, for me, it came in through the work of Lynn Jacobs, Gordon Wheeler, Malcolm Parlett, looking at the impact on the field, on the self, and on the other of being so individually focused, where relational was saying, let's think of yourself, sure, but let's also look at the consequences of your actions. And I think philosophically and from a value space, I certainly felt that was where you and I went, oh yes.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Right. Because we could easily understand, you know, what does it mean to kind of stay with I need this, and you know, here I am, a capable, autonomous individual, willfully going about my life, and if you like, you know, that's the model that we have and certainly a lot of Western countries, that you know, you just, you know, build yourself up and go forth and become successful, etc. And so to temper that, to nuance that with the fact that actually you also need to look at the impact that you're having. It feels straightforward to say here and now, but it's a point that mostly gets lost, especially in organization. And let's not even go to world politics on that front, really. So yeah.
No. Yeah. But it is in there, the significance of that individualistic thrust, and which I guess also became actioned in capitalism. How do I leverage my potential to have resource in order to acquire and hoard more?
Absolutely.
And it's very interesting because I was working in public sector in the 90s when the notion of the internal market came in.
Yes.
And we went from a whole systems approach to departments competing really over budgets. And, you know, if my department was more successful, did that put podiatry out of business?
Yes.
And having managers come in who had experience in the private sector, where competition was the name of the game, working in the public sector, where actually all these services had to be provided for the well-being of the population. So what do we do with the underperformers?
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know, cutting them out didn't feel an effective strategy because we had service users who desperately needed that.
Yes. It
So
certainly made that department more successful, but overall at the loss of everything else, and
exactly,
systemic loss, of course.
yes, yes. Well, I
Yeah.
remember being a fairly competitive person thinking, oh, lovely, you know, we've got some
Yes.
nice floors and ceilings contracts here. We can overperform, acquire more budget and grow, which was the mindset.
Yeah.
And, you know, at the end of 12 months, having a rather unpleasant conversation with the finance manager that the surplus that we had generated from the GP income was now going to fund underperformers who had not done very well at all, but needed to be sustained.
Yeah.
So that pivoting and real clarification of what competition meant in practice in certain areas of service provision was very vivid for me when we met. And the relational formulation became an overarching passion, I guess, that inspired the work.
Yeah, because I mean, a kind of a capitalistic model initially as well never considered almost the fact that there's a limitation to resource. It's
No.
like there was endless resource,
Yeah.
and unless it'll be there if you are good enough, strong enough, clever enough, whatever it is to actually go forth.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I think that needs to be tempered. And I feel in the way we've captured relational,
Mm.
it really brings in the fact that, yes, of course, individuals have needs and they will aggress, but they can't do that without considering the other
Mm.
and also considering the situation actually in which they do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And when you bring those three factors to our attention, I guess we're starting now to get the flavour of some of the first ROG framings
Yes.
were about
Mm.
self, other, and situation,
Yeah.
and that came together to formulate the SOS model and
Absolutely.
framework. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've got sort of perhaps other little videos where we talk more about the SOS, but but just very briefly, I think it won't be lost on people listening to us now that it spells, it's also spells a universal call for help, and I
absolutely.
think it's an indication that fundamentally for us being relational is recognizing that we need each other.
Yes.
We can't pretend to live like self-sufficient individuals.
Mm.
So, and that maintaining, our bodies as healthy organisms, with social isolation is not alone enough for fulfilling and thriving lives, really.
No, no,
Yeah.
no. And I think over the time we've been working together, what's nice is that more and more we're seeing the evidence base for relational approaches grow, that social capital is probably one of the most important factors for physical and mental well-being. How involved and embedded are you in your local community,
Yes, absolutely.
your professional community, and where does your organization sit in the whole ecology of what is going on in the country,
Good.
and probably where does your country sit in the ecology of what's going on in the world? So I think we're seeing more and more, alongside the climate crisis, political crisis, the crisis of capitalism and economic growth, the need for the relational turn, and that has given me hope and certainly sustained me, and I believe sustained us both in carrying on with the work.
Yes, yes. Yes, even
Mm.
though at some times, especially in recent years, we'd think, oh my God, this is lost. People aren't interested in any of this. They're not paying attention. It's all about individual needs and just kind of winning or competition.
Yes, yeah. Reminds me, I'm aware of the time and bringing to a close, but I'm
Yeah.
thinking of a consulting gig I had with a big global brand who were very focused on sustainability, almost as a been an iconic brand for sustainability and alongside climate. And asking the question of, if the field and resources are finite, how much growth and profit will be enough? What will be satisfying? And that being the point really at which there was no answer to that. So I guess that being where the rubber really hits the road around this methodology is, at what point can any of us say, I have enough to sustain myself without needing to acquire more
Absolutely.
at the expense of others?
Yes, absolutely. So that's kind of saying quite a lot, I think we said, about the relational approach. And of course, we can keep going on, I think for hours on that, because it's at the heart of the ROG approach that we've developed together. But I'm wondering whether it would be interesting to see what was the inspiration for ROG for you and for us.
Yeah. Yes, well, I guess if I really think of an inspiration, there is something about that word that touches my spirit. You mentioned the SOS universal cry for help, which is save our souls. There is something foundational, if I go back to the artistic and aesthetic, that is the felt sense, the embodied felt sense of rightness. In Gestalt, we would call that good form.
Yes.
That brings an energy to an action. And I think for me, it is that notion of how the world might be different, how organizations might be different. I came from a public sector background. How those values would be lived and affect the world around me. And that's been the ongoing inspiration. And I guess working with you, a commitment and a deep knowledge that we share that.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think for me as well, it's interesting we were saying, we need that will, we need to recognize our needs. So of course, turning to ROG is also a very primal need in my work as an organizational consultant. In some ways we, again, at some point I was working in the early days with a heavy manufacturing company. I won't name it here, but working with a team with very challenging dynamics, and you could feel that as a consultant, also the clients, there was a lot of fear and a felt sense of feeling unsupported, and how best to sit with all the variety of emotions that were there, and how people could actually face this big, fundamental change that was going on with them. So I think that what the Gestalt approach certainly was for me is an inspiration, because it spoke to my experience of what worked. When I worked with this organization, one of my line manager recommended that I get the help of a psychotherapist who used to work in organizations. And she did some amazing work. So I worked alongside her, and that's really what called me to sort of turn towards Gestalt, because I watched her really heighten awareness and make explicit what was implicit actually in the team, and work not just at individuals like in a therapeutic way, but also at the interpersonal and the group issues. And that was a huge catalyst for change. So that was, hugely, needed for me at the individual level. And of course, the huge inspiration was, as you say, our relationship. We met and we clicked, and we started seeing what else we could develop, and it all made a lot of sense.
Yes. So I'm thinking that this might be a good time we've sort of prepared the ground really for discussing ROG and where we started. And maybe to save some of that for upcoming episodes, because I've now got a lot of topics going through my mind. I've got presence.
Yes.
Because we started individual presence, leadership presence. What is that? Outlining the process. And I think we'll definitely be talking more about that. We've
Mm.
mentioned the SOS model.
Yeah.
You've mentioned will, the discipline of
Yeah.
focus and channeling our energy. But I'm
Yeah.
also thinking how much we've talked about grace in our approach,
Yeah.
the ability to be open and receptive and
Yeah.
hold those in balance.
Yeah.
Um, the impact of dialogue,
Yeah.
you know, that was brought to our field, what that meant when Lynn Jacobs really brought in Buberian dialogue,
Yes. Yeah.
um, how that
I'm
affected
wondering, I'm
values.
wondering whether there's something here about, we've talked about being inspired and
Mm.
inspiring, in some ways, yes.
Yes.
And whether we want to say any more about what this means in a ROG context, particularly.
Mm. To
Uh,
inspire.
yeah, do we have a felt sense of what? Because it's a word that's used a lot. What's the definition of inspiration? And does it?
Well, me being me, of course, I Googled inspiration for the definition.
Okay.
And I'll just read that. This is Collins Online
Yeah.
saying inspiration is a feeling of enthusiasm you
Yeah.
get from someone or something which gives you new and creative ideas.
Ooh.
It's lovely, isn't it? And I guess, if I think of the interventions aspect of ROG,
Yes.
when we're prototyping, when we're innovating, when we are creating,
Yes.
we really are resting on a lot of what has gone before to light that spark in people,
Yeah.
and to bring to the field things that could not have happened
Mm.
if we hadn't come together in a particular way.
Mm. I think that's true. I think you use that word spark, and where that takes me is that in some ways I think inspiration can be viewed, even within our work in two different ways, can't it? And it's also found in that way in philosophy, inspiration as a divine spark.
Yes.
And I think Plato talks about this and Socrates as well.
Mm, mm.
Um, and then on the other hand, we could look at inspiration as something more a natural phenomenon. So
Yes.
that can be cultivated, can be worked on, can be developed, and that again is the
Yes.
willful end
Yes.
rather than the grace. And
Yes.
that is there also in our work.
I love you bringing that in, and because I'm thinking that inspiration in that way is quite close to perspiration. In that there is something about really working and
Yeah,
focusing,
yeah.
and it's not a case of just turn up and see what happens. And I think people might have a misleading idea that when we say it's creative emergent and going with that moment,
Yeah.
that it is a question of just turn up and in actual fact, it's anything but that. There's
Yeah,
a lot of focus and preparation to
absolutely.
surrender to that emerging moment.
Yes, absolutely. God, I could say so much more, but hold me back.
Okay. Well, I think we're probably there for today. Have you got any closing comments that you want to make?
Um, I think maybe just an expression of where I am, which is a lot of gratitude.
Mm,
Uh,
yes.
and maybe that's a really great,
Mm,
for being inspired.
yes.
I think as people, we we're constantly in search of meaning in our lives, and I think inspiration gives us that framing for
Yeah.
meaning in a very deep and connected way, and I think that's what we're hoping to bring in our work with others in ROG, and certainly that's emerged from our connection, Sally. So
Mm.
gratitude.
I've got the warm fuzzies, which is
So, sounds like a good place to stop.
a very good place to stop. Okay, well, look forward to next time.